When I first moved into Oak Ridge Estates, I thought I had found my forever home. It was a picturesque, tree-lined neighborhood with spacious yards, friendly neighbors, and an HOA that, at first glance, seemed like a harmless formality. I was wrong, because Karen lived here. I didn't know who she was at first. I had heard her name mentioned in hushed tones, neighbors muttering about HOA Karen, like she was a local cryptid. I figured they were exaggerating. Then I built my greenhouse. It wasn't just any greenhouse. It was part of a mental health initiative, a small but powerful project aimed at providing a therapeutic space for veterans and trauma survivors. I had worked closely with local officials to make it happen, even securing city grants. It was perfect. Until Karen saw it. The first time she approached me, I was tending to the plants inside, enjoying the quiet hum of the irrigation system. Then, the rattle of an aggressive throat clearing shattered my peace. I turned to see a middle-aged woman in a beige pantsuit standing outside my greenhouse, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was physically restraining herself from setting the place on fire. "Can I help you?" I asked. Her lips curled in disapproval. "Yes, you can explain why this thing is standing in the middle of your yard." I blinked. "You mean my greenhouse?" She made a disgusted sound. "It's an unapproved structure. HOA rules clearly state that all external additions must be approved by the committee. And I don't remember signing off on this, shed." I exhaled slowly, reminding myself that not everyone understood the greenhouse's purpose. "It's not a shed," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's a therapy greenhouse. The city funded part of it, and it's part of a mental health program." Karen's expression didn't change. "Doesn't matter. It's ugly. It doesn't match the aesthetic of Oak Ridge Estates." I raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying the brick red playhouse in your backyard matches the aesthetic?" Her face twitched. "That's different. It's for my grandchildren. And this is for people recovering from PTSD," I shot back. Karen wasn't listening. She whipped out her clipboard. "Where did that even come from?" and tapped a section aggressively. "You'll receive a formal notice tomorrow," she announced, turning on her heel. "And if you don't remove it within 10 days, the HOA will escalate the matter." She stalked off. I stared after her. Was she serious? Oh, she was very serious. The next day, an HOA violation notice appeared on my doorstep. Notice of noncompliance. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that an unauthorized structure has been erected on your property. Per HOA Regulation 4.3b, any external additions require HOA approval prior to construction. Failure to remove the structure within 10 days will result in fines and potential legal action. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, President, Oak Ridge Estates HOA." I wasn't even surprised. Instead, I smirked. Because what Karen didn't know was that I had city approval. And better yet, the mayor's wife had personally helped fund the project. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved for emergencies. Charlotte Dawson, the mayor's wife, answered immediately. "Hey, how's the greenhouse coming along?" "Great," I said. "Except for one thing. My HOA president wants me to tear it down." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Excuse me?" I explained the situation. When I finished, Charlotte's voice had dropped to dangerous levels of anger. "Let me make a few calls." 2 days later, a black SUV rolled into Oak Ridge Estates. Charlotte Dawson stepped out, elegant, powerful, and absolutely furious. And she wasn't alone. She brought 2 city council members and a local journalist who had been covering the city's mental health initiatives. Karen's face when she saw them? Priceless. "Karen Whitmore?" Charlotte's voice was ice cold. Karen, for once, looked nervous. "Why, yes." Charlotte folded her arms. "Would you like to explain why you're trying to shut down a mental health initiative?" Karen paled. I didn't know it was." "You didn't know?" Charlotte cut her off. "Because I personally approved the funding for this project. And now, thanks to your interference, it's going to be in the newspaper." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Rylan, the journalist, was already taking notes. Karen looked between all of us, realizing she had lost. The HOA dropped the complaint within hours. Karen, however, wasn't done. She sent a passive-aggressive email to the neighborhood. Dear residents, while I strive to uphold the highest standards for our community, I recognize that certain exceptions must be made for city initiatives. Though I still believe in uniformity, I will respect the decision regarding the greenhouse. Best, Karen Whitmore. I read it twice. Then I laughed. Charlotte, meanwhile, wasn't done. She had filed an official complaint against Karen for harassment. A month later, at the next HOA meeting, Karen was removed as president. And me? I got to keep my greenhouse. Karen's downfall happened faster than even I expected. The day after the mayor's wife confronted her, the HOA board held an emergency meeting without Karen's input. 2 days later, I heard from my next-door neighbor, Greg, the ultimate HOA gossip source, that multiple residents had come forward with complaints about Karen's history of harassment. Apparently, I wasn't her only victim. She had spent years bullying homeowners over the most trivial violations, from patio furniture colors to the approved height of garden gnomes. By the end of the week, an official vote was scheduled. Karen was about to face the HOA's wrath. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that reeked of stale coffee and passive-aggressive decor choices. It was packed. Karen sat at the head of the table, looking defensive but composed, clearly convinced that she could talk her way out of this. That delusion lasted 5 minutes. The first complaint came from an elderly couple, the Petersons. Karen fined us $250 because our flower beds were too colorful, Mrs. Peterson said, voice shaking. She said it clashed with the HOA's neutral palette. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The second complaint came from a young couple. She reported us to the city for having a children's play set in our backyard, the husband said. We had to go through legal paperwork just to prove we weren't violating any laws. By the 5th complaint, Karen's composure was cracking. By the 10th, she was sweating bullets. Then Charlotte Dawson stood up, and Karen visibly shrank. Ladies and gentlemen, Charlotte said, this community is meant to be a place of belonging, not a dictatorship. If your HOA president is more focused on power trips than the actual well-being of the residents, it's time for a change. The room erupted into applause. Karen shot to her feet. I did what was best for the neighborhood, she shrieked. Someone cut her mic. It was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. Then came the vote. Karen was removed as HOA president with a staggering 93% of residents voting against her. She stormed out of the meeting, red-faced and shaking. And just like that, her reign of terror was over. The best part? After Karen lost her position, her own house was found to be in violation of HOA rules, the very same rules she had weaponized against others. Turns out, her backyard gazebo was built without proper permits. And her driveway extension? Completely illegal under HOA code. She was fined $1,500. She tried to appeal, but without her power in the HOA, no one cared. By the time her fines hit $3,000, she listed her house for sale. 3 months later, she was gone. Without Karen, Oak Ridge Estates became a different neighborhood. People relaxed. The HOA lightened up. My greenhouse? It thrived. More veterans and trauma survivors joined the therapy program. Charlotte even expanded the initiative, using my greenhouse as a model for future projects. One evening, as I tended to the plants, Greg walked over, beer in hand. You know, he said, nodding toward Karen's former house, it's almost peaceful now. I chuckled. Almost? Greg took a sip, smirking. Well, I kinda miss watching you piss her off. I grinned. Yeah, me too. 3 months after Karen's dramatic exit, her house finally sold. Greg and I had placed bets on what kind of person would move in. Maybe it'll be another HOA tyrant, Greg joked. Or worse, a Karen 2.0. I shuddered. Don't even say that out loud. But when moving day came, we were in for a surprise. A young couple, probably in their early 30s, pulled up in a truck loaded with furniture and plants. The man, Chris, was broad-shouldered with an easygoing smile. His wife, Jess, had an air of effortless warmth. And the first thing they did after unloading? They waved at every neighbor and introduced themselves. Greg leaned over, watching from his porch. Well, that's already an improvement. I chuckled. Yeah, but let's see how they handle the HOA. For a while, things were quiet. Jess planted a wildflower garden in the front yard. Chris set up a small fire pit in the backyard. People actually liked them. Then, 2 months in, a HOA notice appeared on their door. Chris read it, his brow furrowing. Then he walked straight to my house. Hey, he said. Did you ever have problems with the HOA? I nearly choked on my coffee. Greg, who had been eavesdropping from his porch, burst out laughing. Oh, buddy. You have no idea who you're talking to. Chris raised an eyebrow. That bad, huh? I took the letter from his hands. And when I saw the fine print, my blood boiled. The violation? Jess's wildflowers weren't aesthetically neutral enough. The demand? They had 10 days to remove them or face a $500 fine. I stared at the letter. Karen might be gone, but her legacy is alive and well. Chris crossed his arms. This is ridiculous. I'm not cutting down my wife's flowers just because some HOA dinosaur thinks neutral is the only acceptable color. Jess walked over, looking frustrated. I grew these myself. How can flowers be a violation? Greg smirked. Welcome to the neighborhood, kids. Chris sighed. So what do we do? I grinned. Oh, don't worry. We handle it. That night, I made a few calls. By morning, at least 8 houses had suddenly sprouted wildflowers in their front yards. By the end of the week, 20 houses. It wasn't just flowers. People put up colorful lawn decorations, planted bright shrubs, even repainted their mailboxes. The message was clear. Screw the HOA's boring, neutral aesthetic. The HOA board had no idea how to respond. They tried issuing more violations, but when half the neighborhood ignored them, they panicked. At the next HOA meeting, Charlotte, now on the board, stood up and addressed the room. Maybe it's time we stop policing every little thing, she said. The HOA should protect property values, not control people's gardens. The motion passed. Jess and Chris's wildflowers stayed. And just like that, Karen's last rule was erased. A year after Karen's downfall, Greenfield Estates felt like a different place. The HOA became more relaxed. Fewer complaints. More community events. Greg still liked to sit on his porch, watching the world go by. Chris and Jess became great friends, and their wildflowers? They spread across the entire neighborhood. One evening, I stepped onto my porch, taking in the view of colorful gardens, happy neighbors, and not a single HOA tyrant in sight. Greg raised his beer. We did good, kid. I smiled. Yeah, we did. For a full year, life in Greenfield Estates had been peaceful. No ridiculous HOA fines, number 911 calls over bicycles, and certainly no one patrolling the neighborhood like a suburban dictator. But just when I thought Karen was finally gone for good, she found a way to haunt us one last time. It started with a letter. Not from the HOA. Not from the city. But from Karen herself. The envelope was thick, the kind used for legal documents. My name was scrawled across the front in aggressively neat handwriting. Greg, watching from his porch, sipped his beer. That better not be what I think it is. I tore it open. And there it was. A cease and desist letter. From Karen's lawyer. Chris and Jess, who had been walking their dog, wandered over. Why do you look like you just saw a ghost? Chris asked. I handed him the letter. To my name. From the law offices of Holloway and Finch. Dear Sir, it has come to our client's attention that you have repeatedly engaged in harassment, defamation, and intentional emotional distress against her during her time as a resident of Greenfield Estates. This includes public humiliation through the filing of fraudulent HOA complaints. Note, this was 100% the actual HOA, not me. Malicious behavior intended to force our client from her home. Hilarious. Encouraging a neighborhood-wide campaign to harass our client. Okay, that part was true, but it was justified. Our client demands that you Cease all communication and reference to her name in any format, verbal or written. Issue a formal apology for your actions. Refrain from any future interference in our client's affairs. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in legal action. Sincerely, Holloway and Finch, attorneys at law. Chris let out a wheeze. She's suing you? Jess read over his shoulder, then burst into laughter. For what? Winning. Greg, still lounging, smirked. I knew she couldn't stay quiet forever. I took a deep breath, then calmly walked to my porch, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number. A familiar voice answered. Sanchez. Officer, I said, barely holding in my laughter. You remember Karen, right? He sighed. What did she do now? 3 days later, I walked into a local law office, documents in hand. Because if Karen wanted a legal fight, she was going to get one. But here's the thing, her entire case was built on delusion. She had no actual proof of harassment. If anything, I had the real evidence of her stalking, false HOA reports, and even attempted theft of my bike. So I did the most petty, satisfying thing possible. I counterfiled a cease and desist order against her. For harassment. For defamation. For wasting law enforcement's time. And then, because I really wanted to drive the point home, I had my lawyer send a letter back to hers, formally declining her demands and warning her that if she contacted me again, I'd sue for harassment. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Greg. Guess who was just spotted in the HOA office? He asked. I grinned. Karen. Bingo. Apparently, she had tried one last time to convince the HOA to ban bicycles, wildflowers, and outdoor furniture, claiming they were lowering neighborhood standards. The HOA board? They laughed her out of the building. And just like that, she was officially done. She never contacted me again. No more fake violations. No more passive-aggressive nonsense. No more HOA tyranny. She was finally gone. A month later, Greenfield Estates held a block party, something Karen would have hated. Lawn chairs. Barbecue grills. Kids riding bikes in plain sight. Chris and Jess had even made Karen's old house into an Airbnb. The best part? The guest welcome basket included a history of the HOA drama, complete with a chapter on the reign and fall of Karen. Greg, lounging in his usual spot, raised his beer. To a Karen-free neighborhood. I smiled. To peace. And then, I parked my bike on my porch. Because I could. For months, Greenfield Estates thrived without Karen's oppressive presence. No one missed her and life felt normal. Until one day, when something strange happened. A white sedan was spotted slowly driving through the neighborhood. Chris noticed it first. That car's been circling the block 3 times now. Greg, sipping his beer, didn't even look up. We both know who it is. I peered through my window, watching as the car inched past my house, stopping for just a second too long before speeding up again. It had tinted windows. But I didn't need to see inside to know. It was her. Karen. Karen hadn't set foot in Greenfield Estates since her downfall. But seeing her car roll through 3 times in one afternoon? That wasn't an accident. It was a Karen reconnaissance mission. Chris, standing next to me, crossed his arms. You think she's planning something? Greg chuckled. Nah, she's just checking if we crumbled without her leadership. Jess rolled her eyes. She's probably furious that the neighborhood looks better than ever. And honestly, that thought made me smile. The gardens were thriving. The HOA wasn't terrorizing people. Greg had even painted his mailbox purple, purely because Karen once complained about non-traditional colors. Karen had lost. And now? She was forced to watch from the outside. That night, I had an idea. If Karen was still lurking around, she deserved a proper farewell. So I grabbed a poster board, a thick marker, and wrote a message in huge, bold letters. The next morning, I propped it against my porch, right next to my bike. It read, "Still here, Karen." Greg nearly spit out his coffee laughing. Chris and Jess lost it. And the best part? That same white sedan rolled by one last time that afternoon. It slowed for exactly 4 seconds in front of my house. Then it sped off and never returned. Karen was gone for good. Greenfield Estates thrived. No one policed mailbox colors or called 911 over a bicycle. Chris and Jess became lifelong friends. Greg remained the neighborhood beer-drinking philosopher. And me? I kept my bike parked right where Karen had always hated it. Because at the end of the day, petty always wins. Just when I thought life in Greenfield Estates had finally reached its peaceful peak, the HOA pulled one last stunt. It started with a letter in the mail. At first, I thought it was junk. But when I saw the HOA logo and the words, "Mandatory HOA meeting," I knew something was up. I opened it. Dear homeowner, due to recent changes in the HOA structure, we will be holding a mandatory meeting to discuss new compliance regulations and updates to community enforcement policies. Attendance is required. Sincerely, Greenfield Estates HOA Board. Greg read over my shoulder, taking a deep sip of his beer. Let me guess, he muttered. They're trying to bring back the tyranny? Chris frowned. This reeks of Karen's influence. Jess nodded. You don't think she's back, do you? A deep silence fell over the group. And then Greg muttered, well, if she is back, we better be ready. The meeting was packed. Every homeowner in Greenfield Estates filled the clubhouse, waiting for whatever nonsense the HOA had in store. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat at their long table, looking smug. And then the new president walked in. Not Karen, but a man in an oversized suit and an air of self-importance. Good evening, he said, clearing his throat. As you all know, the HOA has been undergoing restructuring after previous leadership failures. Translation: after Karen got kicked out in disgrace. We are here today to discuss new compliance regulations that will ensure the integrity and beauty of our neighborhood. I could already feel the nonsense coming. Then he pulled out a document labeled New Regulations Proposal. I knew exactly what was happening. They were trying to bring back all the rules Karen had enforced. Banned colors. Strict lawn regulations. And worst of all, bikes prohibited on front porches. I nearly laughed out loud. They were trying to undo everything we fought for. And that's when I knew. It was time for a neighborhood rebellion. Before the board could even begin their power grab, I stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear. Everyone turned. Greg grinned. Chris leaned back. Jess looked thrilled. I'd like to formally oppose this entire proposal. The board president frowned. Excuse me? I held up my copy of the HOA bylaws, the same document Karen had weaponized for years. You see, according to Section 4.3 of the HOA Charter, any new compliance rules must be approved by a full vote of homeowners. I smiled. And I don't think you have the votes. Murmurs spread through the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Then Charlotte, the same woman who helped take Karen down, stood up. I second that opposition, she said, loud and clear. Then Greg stood. Then Chris. Then Jess. Then nearly half the room. The HOA president paled. But, he started. The community has spoken. Greg cut him off. And we vote no. The board sat there, stunned. And just like that, the proposal died. With the power grab defeated, the HOA had no choice but to back down. Karen's influence was officially gone. A week later, the entire HOA board resigned. And the best part? Charlotte was elected as the new HOA president, with one of her first acts being to make HOA enforcement more relaxed and fair. As for Karen, she was never seen in Greenfield Estates again. And my bike? Still on my porch. Still right where it belongs. With the HOA coup crushed and Karen gone forever, or so we thought, Greenfield Estates finally settled into its golden age. No ridiculous complaints. No fake violation notices. No HOA dictators terrorizing bicycles and flamingos. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt normal. But then Karen returned. And she didn't come alone. It happened on a Saturday morning. Greg and I were grilling burgers in his yard when Jess's alarm scream echoed from across the street. No way. We whipped around. And there she was. Karen. Standing in the driveway of a brand new house. Jess stormed over, completely ignoring the fact that she was still in pajamas. Are you seriously moving back? Karen turned, looking smug as ever. Oh, I'm not moving back. But my sister is. Greg immediately stopped flipping burgers. Jess blinked. Wait. You have a sister. Her name is Deborah, Karen said proudly. And as if on cue, Deborah stepped outside. She looked exactly like Karen, but somehow worse. Colder, sharper, and holding a clipboard. Greg muttered, "Oh, sweet hell." Then Deborah smiled, a tight, corporate smile. "Hello, neighbors," she said. "I look forward to bringing order back to this community." Greg dropped his spatula. Deborah wasted no time making her presence known. Within 48 hours, she had reapplied for HOA board membership, sent out a survey asking if the neighborhood wanted stricter guidelines, photographed Greg's lawn flamingos. Greg was seething. "This is a declaration of war," he growled. Jess was pacing. "How do we stop her? We can't go through another Karen era." I crossed my arms. "We don't stop her." Greg stared at me. "What?" I smirked. "We convert her." Jess sputtered. "What does that even mean?" "It means," I said, "we introduce her to the joy of breaking stupid HOA rules." Greg leaned forward. "Go on." Step 1 was casual exposure. We started inviting Deborah to social events. First, Greg's barbecue nights. Then, Jess's book club, which was mostly wine and gossip. Finally, game night, where we made sure she saw how much fun rule-breaking could be. Step 2? Flamingo integration. We gifted her a single plastic flamingo as a welcome present. She hated it. But after 3 weeks, we caught her smiling at it. Step 3? Corrupting her with convenience. We got her hooked on Greg's outdoor beer fridge. We introduced her to Jess's Wine Wednesdays. We convinced her to leave her trash bins out overnight. Little by little, Deborah stopped caring. One night, it finally happened. Deborah sat on Greg's porch, sipping a beer, staring at a flamingo in deep thought. Then she muttered, "HOA rules are kind of dumb." Jess choked on her drink. Greg froze mid-bite. I grinned. Welcome to the dark side. The next morning, Deborah officially withdrew her HOA application. The final Karen was defeated. And as a final act of rebellion, she put 3 more flamingos in her yard. Greg was so proud he cried. As for Karen, she never showed her face again. And my bike? Still parked on my porch. Right where it belongs. Just when we thought the HOA had fully surrendered, they pulled one last stunt. A letter arrived in every mailbox. Subject, Community Improvement Initiative. Dear residents, to maintain the beauty and order of Greenfield Estates, the HOA has implemented a mandatory property aesthetic audit. All homes will be inspected for compliance with neighborhood standards. Any violations will require immediate correction. Sincerely, Greenfield Estates HOA Board. Greg read the letter. Then he lit it on fire with his grill. "These people are like roaches," he muttered. "They never die." Jess frowned. "What the hell is a property aesthetic audit?" I sighed. "It's Karen nonsense, but without Karen." And that's when Deborah stepped up. "You want me to fix this?" she asked, arms crossed. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Fix it how?" Deborah smiled. "By breaking the HOA from the inside." Step 1. Get Deborah elected to the board. With Karen gone and half the board quitting, it wasn't hard to get Deborah voted in. Step 2. Flood the HOA with paperwork. Deborah drowned the remaining HOA members in endless bureaucratic chaos. She requested clarifications on every rule. She needed extra documentation for every complaint. She buried the board in so much paperwork that they started quitting out of frustration. Step 3. Destroy the HOA from within. At the next HOA meeting, Deborah proposed an amendment. "I propose we make HOA membership optional." The board sputtered. "That's not allowed," one of the few remaining members snapped. Deborah smiled. "Actually, it is." I checked the bylaws. A vote was held. And because half the neighborhood now hated the HOA, it passed. The HOA lost all power. With HOA membership now optional, almost every homeowner withdrew. The tyranny was over. No more fake violations. No more Karen-style complaints. No more bicycle bans. Greg celebrated by erecting a 10-foot inflatable flamingo on his lawn. Jess and Mike threw a massive street party. And me? I sat on my porch, looked at my perfectly parked bike, and smiled. For the first time ever, Greenfield Estates belonged to the people. Months later, we got one last final piece of closure. Karen's former house was finally sold. The new owner? A man with 5 kids, 3 dogs, and a garage full of motorcycles. Jess nearly passed out from laughter. Greg raised a toast. And as we watched a pack of children ride their bikes freely down the street, I leaned back and soaked in the victory. Greenfield Estates had survived the worst. Karen was gone. The HOA was dead. And the flamingos? Stronger than ever. For months, Greenfield Estates thrived without an HOA. No more petty complaints. No more bizarre rules. No more random Karen attacks. It was paradise. Until one day, a new letter arrived. Not from the HOA. Not from a neighbor. But from Karen herself. Greg held up the letter like it was a ticking bomb. Jess gasped. No. No way. Mike grabbed it. Holy crap. She wrote a manifesto. We all huddled around as he read. Subject: a warning from a concerned former resident. Dear residents of Greenfield Estates, I write this letter with deep sadness. Since my departure, I have watched this once pristine neighborhood descend into chaos. I have received troubling reports of flamingos multiplying unchecked, bicycles being parked openly, a general disregard for community standards. This is not what Greenfield Estates was meant to be. I urge you to reconsider your lawless ways before it is too late. Sincerely, Karen. Greg wheezed. She thinks she's sending us a prophecy. Jess snatched the letter. What does she mean by too late? Mike smirked. Sounds like a threat. I folded my arms. So what do? Greg grinned. We throw a party. A week later, we hosted the largest neighborhood gathering in Greenfield Estates history. We called it the Karen is Gone block party. Every driveway was packed with grills. Music blasted through the cul-de-sac. Kids rode bikes freely without fear of HOA retribution. And in the center of it all, Greg's flamingo army had tripled in size. At sunset, we read Karen's letter aloud. Then, in a ceremonial gesture, we lit it on fire and roasted marshmallows over it. The entire neighborhood cheered. And in that moment, we banished Karen's spirit from Greenfield Estates forever. From that day forward, Greenfield Estates became legendary. People moved in just to escape HOA tyranny. Greg became mayor of the unofficial Flamingo Republic. Deborah even started a business selling ironic, Karen-proof lawn decor. As for me, I still park my bike on my porch. Every day. Just because I can. And every now and then, when the wind is just right. I like to imagine Karen somewhere far away, shaking with pure rage. And that, my friends, is the real victory. Just when we thought Karen's curse had been lifted, the universe decided to test us one last time. It started with an anonymous letter. Not from Karen. Not from the HOA. Not even from Deborah, our reformed Karen infiltrator turned ally. This was something worse. It read, to the residents of Greenfield Estates, it has come to our attention that your neighborhood has been operating without an official HOA. This is a violation of county zoning policies. To correct this, Greenfield Estates will be reabsorbed into the Greater Oakwood HOA district. A representative will arrive next week to begin enforcement of community standards. Thank you for your cooperation. Greater Oakwood HOA. Greg read the letter. Then he threw it in the fire pit. Jess clutched her chest. We just got out. How's this happening? Mike groaned. Did they just force us back into an HOA? I exhaled. This is worse than Karen. Greg cracked his knuckles. Guess we're going to war one last time. A week later, a brand new HOA rep rolled into town. Her name was Linda. She arrived in a shiny white Lexus, stepped out in heels that had never touched grass before, and immediately took out a clipboard. Hello, homeowners, she announced. I am here to restore order to this charming little community. Jess muttered, oh, she's worse than Karen. Greg cracked open a beer. Ma'am, we're not interested. Linda smiled tightly. Oh, but you must comply. Then she pointed at Greg's flamingos. Those will have to go. A deep silence fell over the cul-de-sac. Greg slowly set his beer down. Jess took a step back. Oh no. She done messed up. The neighborhood had faced many enemies. Karen, the old HOA, Ted and his clipboard army. But this? This was our final boss fight. Linda didn't just want control, she wanted total submission. Within 3 days, she sent out 50 violation notices. Greg's flamingos? Illegal. Bikes on porches? Unacceptable. Deborah's outdoor beer fridge? A disturbance to community order. That's when Greg uttered the words that would go down in history. She wants war? We'll give her war. We mobilized the neighborhood. Jess hacked the HOA email list and spammed them with complaints about Linda's presence. Mike printed fake violation notices for Linda's own car, citing excessive smugness. Deborah, our secret weapon, joined Oakwood's HOA board and immediately started dismantling it from within. Then, the final act of rebellion. Greg bought 100 flamingos. And overnight, we planted them all over the neighborhood. Every yard. Every sidewalk. Even inside Linda's hotel parking spot. The next morning, Linda stepped outside and screamed. Within 24 hours, Oakwood HOA collapsed. Deborah filed a formal complaint against Linda for abuse of authority. The county zoning office confirmed we didn't have to be reabsorbed. And Linda? She quit on the spot. She drove away in her Lexus, flamingo feathers still stuck to her windshield. Greg popped a beer. Well, that was fun. Jess exhaled. Are we finally free? I smiled. Greenfield Estates had been tested. We had faced the worst. And we had won. Months later, things had never been better. Greg was still president of our Flamingo Republic. Bikes were everywhere. The HOA was gone forever. And in the center of it all, standing proudly in Greg's yard, was the biggest, pinkest flamingo yet. A memorial to everything we had fought for. As I leaned back on my porch, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes freely, I smiled. This was victory. This was home. And somewhere, in the distance, I liked to imagine Karen sobbing uncontrollably. Just when we thought the HOA was finally dead, the universe hit us with one last twist. It started with a notice. This time, it wasn't from Oakwood HOA. It wasn't from some clipboard-wielding tyrant. And it definitely wasn't from Karen. This one came from the county. Official notice. Dear residents of Greenfield Estates, due to the recent dissolution of HOA governance, your neighborhood is now subject to county-wide property codes. A representative will be conducting an inspection next week to assess community compliance with municipal guidelines. Failure to meet standard property aesthetics may result in fines or mandatory corrections. Sincerely, County Zoning and Code Enforcement. Greg stared at the letter. Then he cracked open a whiskey bottle instead of a beer. Jess groaned. I swear to God, if a government Karen shows up, I'm moving to a cabin in the woods. Mike shook his head. No way, this is random. Somebody called them on us. We all looked at each other. Then, at the same time, we said it. Karen. We did some digging. And by digging, I mean Deborah still had access to HOA emails. Within 24 hours, we found it. An anonymous complaint filed to the county 2 weeks ago. The details? Improper decorations, aka the Flamingo Army. Unregistered vehicles, aka bikes on porches. Unauthorized outdoor appliances, Greg's beer fridge. And the final clue? The email was signed, KL. Greg slammed his drink down. She's still watching us. Jess clenched her fists. She might not live here anymore, but she's still trying to control us. Mike sighed. So what do we do? Greg grinned. We fight back. The county sent a guy named Mr. Douglas. Middle-aged. Wore a cheap suit and a permanent look of regret. We were ready. Jess distracted him with dozens of technical questions about zoning laws. Mike and I led him in circles, showing him issues that didn't actually exist. Greg? Greg invited him for a beer. And somehow that worked. After 3 hours of nonsense, Douglas finally sighed deeply. Look, he muttered, rubbing his temples. I don't care about flamingos. I don't care about bikes. I definitely don't care about outdoor beer fridges. He pulled out his clipboard. I'm signing off on everything. No violations. We cheered. Then Greg handed him a flamingo. Douglas took it. And then, in a true miracle, he smiled. I'll put this in my yard, he muttered. Just to piss off my HOA. And with that, he left. That night, we celebrated. But we all knew the truth. Karen wasn't gone. She was waiting. Watching. Scheming. So we did something insane. We formed the Karen Defense Network. A neighborhood-wide alert system to detect any future Karen interference. Greg installed porch cameras. Jess set up anonymous tip lines. Mike trained his dog to bark at anyone holding a clipboard. We would never be caught off guard again. Months later, we got confirmation. Karen tried filing another county complaint. But this time, the county ignored it. Her power was officially gone. Greenfield Estates was finally, truly free. And somewhere, far away, in a lonely beige McMansion, Karen probably sat, clutching her pearls in rage. We had won. Forever. Months passed. Greenfield Estates thrived without HOA tyranny. Greg's beer fridge expanded into a full-blown backyard barbecue station. Jess started a neighborhood newsletter called The Flamingo Report. Mike built a bike ramp for the local kids, ensuring maximum Karen disapproval. Everything was perfect. Until we received the warning. It came in the form of a single, unmarked letter. No return address. No HOA branding. Just one cryptic sentence typed in the center of the page. The storm is coming. Greg squinted. Okay, that's creepy as hell. Jess shuddered. Is this like a cult thing? Mike checked the envelope. No sender info. No postage. This was hand-delivered. We all exchanged looks. Because we knew only one person would go to these lengths. Karen. We gathered the entire neighborhood for an emergency Karen defense meeting. Greg, now fully embracing his Flamingo Republic leadership role, stood at the front of his yard, addressing the concerned citizens. Folks, he said, cracking open a beer. We've been too comfortable. Murmurs of agreement. For months, we've lived in peace. But deep down, we all knew. He held up the letter. Karen was not done. Gasps. A baby cried in the distance. Jess stepped forward. We don't know what the storm means. But we must prepare. Charlotte nodded. What's the plan? Greg grinned. We beat her at her own game. If Karen wanted to haunt us with paranoia, we would haunt her right back. Step 1. We created a fake HOA. Mike designed official-looking letterheads for a new HOA entity. Greenfield Estates Ultimate Neighborhood Committee and Enforcement. GUNC. Jess. Greg, that spells guns. Greg. Damn right it does. Step 2. We sent Karen a violation notice. We wrote, Dear Ms. Karen, it has come to our attention that you are violating Article 7, Section 3 of the GUNC Guidelines, which strictly prohibits interfering with communities you no longer live in, weaponizing HOAs as a form of psychological warfare, general Karen-like behavior. Failure to comply will result in a mandatory neighborhood exile review. Sincerely, GUNC Enforcement Board. Step 3. We waited. And, oh boy, did we get a response. 2 days later, Karen called Greg. Directly. Greg put her on speakerphone. Karen, what is guns? Greg, completely deadpan. I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am. Karen, you sent me a fake HOA letter. Greg, oh, so now you admit HOA rules aren't actual laws? Interesting. Silence. Then, she screamed and hung up. Greg took a victory sip of his beer. Mission accomplished. After the GUNC incident, Karen disappeared from our lives forever. She never sent another letter. She never filed another complaint. She never dared show her face again. Greenfield Estates was finally, truly, eternally free. And in the center of the neighborhood, standing proudly in Greg's yard, was the Grand Flamingo Monument. A permanent reminder that no matter how many Karens tried to rise, the Flamingo Republic would always stand. Years passed. Greg retired from his fake HOA presidency, but the title of Flamingo General remained honorary. Jess's newsletter became famous, attracting HOA haters from all over the country. Mike built a community bike park, officially making porch bikes a celebrated neighborhood tradition. And me? Every morning, I still walk outside, look at my perfectly parked bike, and smile. Because Karen may have tried to control us. But at the end of the day, we were unstoppable. Greenfield Estates had won the war. No more HOAs. No more Karen tyranny. No more ridiculous rules. And though years passed, our stories spread far and wide. People from all over came to see Greg's grand flamingo monument. Jess's newsletter became a national sensation. Even Officer Sanchez retired peacefully, knowing he would never again have to deal with bizarre bicycle complaints. And Karen? She faded into irrelevance. No one knows where she went. No one cares. Because in the end, she was nothing but a footnote in the unstoppable rise of the Flamingo Republic. And as I sit here now, looking at my perfectly parked bike, I know one thing for certain. She lost. And we won. Forever.